Appleknocker Radio.
All right, Dr. Rose, thank you very much for joining us. I appreciate it.
It is a pleasure to be here today, Jeff.
Excellent. So it's a fascinating subject matter. I've been digging through your book. There's so much in there. I feel like the conversation could go in 100 different directions. So I'm going to keep myself constrained to a manageable time limit here. So the first thing I'd want to ask, if you could just familiarize the people who haven't read the book and who should read the book, because it's a great book. What is the general concept of spirit marriage?
Yeah. So spirit marriage is the bonded or intimate relationship with a human and a non-ordinary or otherworldly being. And I like to use the word spirit because it's sort of the broadest catch-all of terms that can include a whole bunch of different kinds of non-physical, non-human beings. So deities, angels, elementals, beloved dead, those all kind of fall under the auspices of the term spirit. And marriage is, again, the best term that I could come up with to convey the idea that humans can have really committed and depthful relationships with these otherworldly beings. And some folks will ask me, well, what's the difference between like a spirit marriage and like channeling or mediumship or having a spirit contact? And I like to say it's kind of a continuum. It's like, a contact or a guide or a mediumship kind of relationship is typically like, a friend or even like you're dating around maybe a little bit. But the marriage is just that. It is committed. My research was really talking to contemporary practitioners of spirit marriage. And in almost every single case, there was some sort of a ritual that bonded them to that spirit. And so it's a very specific, highly structured in a lot of ways kind of practice that is maybe a little more of an advanced practice than some of these other kinds of spirit contact relationships.
And you said that in your research, you found this throughout various cultures and throughout just basically all of time, right? Mm-hmm. Even though the various cultures have different names for whatever these things may be, or a different name for the marriage process. So could you go over some highlights from the archaeological historical research? Yeah,
well, some of the first documented records of spirit marriage we find are in ancient Mesopotamia and the Sumerian sacred marriage, where the priest or the priestess would marry the god or the goddess. And in this case that I'm thinking of, it was the priests and the priestesses of Ishtar. The goddess Ishtar would marry her and then were essentially the temple keepers and expected to do certain rites and uphold certain traditions that honored her and revered her. But that is not by any means limited to ancient Mesopotamia. I mean, my research, when I really began to dig into it, it shows up transculturally. I mean, from China to India to Siberia to the Western Europe, Africa, North America, South America. I mean, every continent and many, many, many cultures have at least origin myths of this kind of extraordinary coupling or extraordinary mating of humans, or even just outside of the context of like mating, this union, right, between a human and an otherworldly being. For example, in ancient Greece, Rome. Let me just take that again. For example, in ancient Rome, the first Sabine king of Rome, Numa Pompilius, was actually married to a nymph, right? He had a spirit wife, and her name was Egeria. And Egeria is actually credited with giving him the first Roman laws,
really,
and practices that she was an intermediary for him with other deities, particularly Zeus, and was a guide and a counselor. And when you read the text around it, it talks about an intimacy between the two of them and that they loved each other. And so And that's, again, by no means the only example. It appears again and again, from Plutarch to Herodotus to, the African traditions that are still active with this, particularly in West Africa and Burkina Faso. There's a tribe there called the Dagara people that practice spirit marriage to a whole host of different kinds of beings. And it's in the Norse tradition, and on and on and on and on. I mean, I could just talk this entire time about all the different examples that appear from both historical accounts all the way up into contemporary times. But I really focused my research on the contemporary practices. I did sort of like a overview of the historical. I looked at history and anthropology and folklore and mythology and religion primarily, and then some esoteric occult figures. But then what I really wanted to do was show it's still happening today. Here's how the contemporary people practice it. And here's maybe some clues as to why it's still happening.
Is there any, is it generally either historically or contemporary or both? Is it generally human females with spiritual males or human males with spiritual females, or is it pretty evenly mixed? I
think it's really across the board. I mean, we find a lot of written accounts, of gods coming down. Like, I mean, we think of Zeus, right? Zeus was notorious for impregnating human women. And, maybe we hear about those accounts more because that they're talking about the progeny, right? The offspring. And so the women are giving birth to the children. But no, it's by no means limited by that. I would say, one of the stories that comes to mind is the 13th century Thomas the Rhymer, who was an actual historical figure, Thomas of Ercildoune in Scotland. And he was taken by the fairy queen and lived in the land of fairy for a while, and then came back into the human world with special gifts. He was given the gift of prophecy and the gift of poetry, and he was consulted by the people of that time and by the regents of that time as a seer, right? As someone who had this prophetic ability that he attributed to, one of the gifts that was given to him through his fairy marriage. So, and he's by no means the only person that we have record of that was, historically wed to some sort of extraordinary being.
So this is something I don't recall you going over this in the book, and this might be a silly question, but anytime I hear of like the fairy realms, I always think of Jacques Vallée and his research into the overlap between the UFO and the fairy world, and how it's all kind of one phenomenon, right? Has there been any overlap with the UFO encounters and what you would call spirit marriage?
So yeah, two pieces to that. One is that the shining ones, which are traditionally thought to be another name for the fairy people in Ireland and Scotland, and the UK, were originally said to have a riv. They arose. My tongue just got totally tight.
A little bit of a tongue twister.
So the shining ones that are generally understood to be the fairy people in the UK and Ireland were said to have arrived on shining ships from the sky, right? So this is probably what you're referring to, that they were considered to be sort of off planet, right? And then came here. And again, the Dogon people have this mythology. They're Native American tribes that claim a descent from off-planet sort of being. So not just unique to the fairy tradition, but in any event, I have anecdotally talked to folks who say that they have an off-planet or an extraterrestrial spirit spouse contact. So it's not unheard of. It's not anything that I have found has been academically or even parapsychologically documented, but anecdotally, yeah, I've run across that.
Okay. I don't know if you're familiar with Valet, but he basically contends that these are all the same phenomenon. They're just different perceptions of the same underlying phenomenon. That's why I asked it. I didn't mean to like bring in the UFO thing out of nowhere.
No, it's interesting because my mentor, Orion Foxwood, who is a fairy seer and a British traditional witch, he asked his fairy wife, Bree, what about angels and off-planet beings? And she said, oh, they're the fairy folk of the cosmos. And he said, well, who are you? And she said, well, we're the angelic beings of the planet. And so there's this, when you start stepping into an animist view of the world, of the planet, of the cosmos, it's a lot less about here versus there, or us versus them. It's like consciousnesses nested within consciousnesses, nested within consciousnesses, and up, down, in, out, particularly when we're talking about anything beyond three-dimensional reality, becomes very wibbly wobbly, right? Because that it's not, again, bound by time space like we are. And so these extraordinary or otherworldly beings have many different cosmological origins and can, potentially come from anywhere.
Man, that's really fascinating stuff. So, question I had, why would, actually, before I get into this, because this directly relates to down on a smaller micro level, individuals making this choice, you yourself are in a spirit marriage, correct?
Yes.
Could you please just expand on how that came to be and how it laced in with your broader research into the phenomenon, or not the phenomenon, the act?
The practice. Yeah. Well, I like to start with saying that I was raised in the Pentecostal Christian tradition. And so right there out of the womb, I was practicing these sort of paranormal type things like speaking in tongues and laying on of hands and channeling the Holy Spirit. So I was sort of, prima materia for this kind of contact. And then, I became, as a young adult, fascinated with the way in which those kinds of practices manifested in and through my body. And so I went on and in graduate school, went to seminary, to the Graduate Theological Union, to sort of study comparative religion and comparative spiritual practices. And then after seminary, I felt like I'd spent a lot of time in the academic world up here, and I really wanted to ground down into my body more. So I began to train as a holistic healing practitioner and study things like Taoist sexual love practices and Shakta Tantra and ceremonial magic and eventually fairy seership, really to try and get more of an embodied, as well as like a whole host of healing modalities that I won't go into, but really to try and understand what it is that our body does when we interface with the numinous, right? When we interface with spiritual energy, and how is that innate to us, and how is it also something that we can cultivate a relationship with? And so along those lines, I started having, this is about 20 years ago, I started having a recurring dream figure. And as a psychologist, I always want to first look at, when I'm having an extraordinary experience, how much of that is me? How much of that is me projecting or fantasizing or whatever? But I had a really good team. I had a psychotherapist and different coaches and mentors and stuff around me to really help me assess. And that's part of the initiatory process that I went through with ceremonial magic and these other things, to really get a good foundation underneath me, what I call sort of checks and balances, to really help assess that, those experiences. And so that dream contact, which was often a kind of an erotic, or what registered in my body as this vitalizing eros energy, at some point started asking me to marry it. And that was noteworthy. I mean, that was new. That was sort of out of left field for me. I didn't really have any context at that time for spirit marriage, other than I remembered when I was in seminary that we had studied some of the Enochian texts about how the sons of God, the angels, saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and took unto them wives, and gave birth to the Nephilim. That was Genesis 6, I think 2-4. And then in the Enochian texts, which are extra canonical. So I was like, okay, well, there's some precedent for this, but why is this happening now? So I became sort of fascinated by this subject matter and studied it on my own for a number of years, and then decided, this really deserves, being an academic, this really deserves scholarly research to do it properly and to do it justice. And so that's when I went back and did my PhD, really focusing and honing in on understanding the phenomenology and the practice of spirit marriage in contemporary practice. And it's been an interesting journey. I interviewed 9 different practitioners, contemporary practitioners of spirit marriage in about 7 different traditions, totally in disparate parts of, disparate traditions from all over the, globe, and found that the stories were strikingly similar. I mean, each lineage has its distinct uniqueness, but the threads that I was hearing, the stories that I'm hearing, which I share in the book, had some very, very interesting similarities and were really helping me inform myself as to what was going on for me. Because that's kind of why I started the research. I didn't know what was going on. I wasn't about to jump into any sort of relationship or commitment with any being, human or other, embodied or other, without really getting to know what they wanted and what the agenda was and what the purpose of the relationship is. So that was sort of my due diligence in my own journey, was doing the research.
Yeah. And so it's actually, you're obviously a very intelligent person. You're a highly educated person. And obviously coming out with these ideas, it's a big risk to your reputation and possibly even professionally, right? But in the book, you talk about why you decided to do this anyway, why you just come out and talk about this. Could you share why you just make this public and you're just out here talking to everybody about it?
Well, I think that number one, it's time. I think that I know that many people are having this experience because that pieces of my research have been available since 2011. And I get people from all over the world emailing me saying, I'm having this experience. I thought I was the only one. Or you're the only person that's talking about this and not shaming me and not making me feel like I'm doing something wrong, or like I'm mentally, losing it. And so, as a practitioner of marginalized spirituality myself, and somebody who has studied it, I feel like we have some hurdles to get over here in the West. Hurdles that say if something isn't measurable by bits down to its bits and bytes, and if we can't scientifically prove something, it's not real. And that is a very Western and a very colonialist mindset, meaning our scientism is the truth, and our science and what science can prove and what science says is the only verifiable truth, and there's nothing else, out there that is real unless science validates it. And science is, let me just say, science is grand. We love science. Science does wonderful things for us to keep us healthy and safe and vibrant. But it has its limits when we're talking about concepts that have to do with the human psychospiritual complex. Love cannot be scientifically measured. Faith cannot be scientifically measured. Compassion, all of these different things that are more numinous qualities, and in my opinion, can be more evolved or elevated qualities of our species. None of these things can be broken down into measurable units. And so, we live under this yoke of Western scientism, which is sort of the be all end all of mainstream academic thinking. And fortunately, over the past, 50 years or so, decolonialist and feminist and indigenous scholars have come along and said, y'all are absolutely projecting those values onto groups of people that do not abide by or uphold those same ideas, and they're generally from cultures that are have been marginalized or colonized. And so one of the things that I thought was really important with this research was to frame it through a decolonizing feminist lens. And it's the same thing with women and women's spirituality and women's embodied practice is, everything is sort of in mainstream academia is from the neck up, right? It's all about the mind and what you can think and analyze and argue. And the wisdom of the body is often left out. And the wisdom of the body, the somatic experience of the body is connected to our consciousness and our connectivity to the planet, right? And to other species and to each other. And so I felt that, the risk of not saying anything about this was greater because we're really at a tipping point right now on the planet, right? We're at a tipping point where if we continue with this neck up way in which we're approaching each other and approaching the planet, it's pretty clear that we're not going to make it as a species. The planet will probably be fine and can recover. Humans very well may not survive. And the only way I think that really we're going to be able to move forward in a healthy and a balanced way is if we integrate, right, the head, the heart, our vitality, right, our potency, and realize that humans are but one player, right, but one consciousness, and maybe not even the most evolved consciousness. There's arguments that some of the cetaceans have more evolution than consciousness-wise than humans do. In any event, this idea that Gaia, right, our planet, this gorgeous planet that we live in, is consciousnesses nested within consciousnesses, nested within consciousnesses. We are in relationality. We're in relationship with those consciousnesses, not as the dominator, not as even the most important, but as a sort of integral dance partner. And I think when we step into more of an animist view, and most of these marginalized traditions have a kind of an animist approach to the planet, we realize that we are in relationship with, consciousness, intelligence, however you want to language that, from the tiniest mycelium, right? The tiniest bacteria, to the largest oceanic bodies full of layers and layers of consciousness within them. And stepping into relationships, stepping into communication, stepping into devotion with planet and with otherworldly or other more than human consciousness on this planet really, I think, will help us move forward as a species, help us evolve, help us step out of our anthropocentric worldview and into a much more integral one.
Before going on to the next question, I just want to clarify, because I started thinking about how I framed that last question. The reason why I framed it as you're obviously a very intelligent, educated, what I was saying was you had to know you were going to get some pushback when you shared these thoughts. I wasn't trying to disparage your beliefs.
No.
Okay. Just making sure there. No, just making sure. I always think back to my wording when I say things like, wait a minute, did I word that right? So, all right.
Yeah, but I mean, it's a valid question. And, it took me 10 years to write this research. And that's part of the reason why, because I knew that I needed to be ready to sort of come out of the closet. Right. Mm-hmm. And I also knew that my community, the culture, the planet around me also needed to be ready to receive it. And I think we really are at a place right now where, that doesn't mean I'm not getting blowback, but what I am saying is if you are critiquing this because that you think that spirits aren't real, you are looking at it from a very colonialist lens. And if you are critiquing this because that you're saying eroticism with otherworldly beings is dangerous, you're looking at it from a very disembodied lens. Because, if we just take a step over into the Shakta Tantric and the Hindu worldview, we're stepping into enlivening practices that are deeply devoted to divine beings, right? That you can have this co-creative relationship with, that the eros, or the vitality of your body, enlivens to a point that your devotional relationship is intimate and bonded and loving. And that is a very transgressive worldview, even within the Hindu context. The tantrics are transgressive, but it is also not unique to that culture. It appears over and over and over and over and over again. And what I've been trying to do is just collect all the pearls on the thread and sort of weave it together into a little more of a cohesive conversation. And so also that practitioners of these traditions are talking to each other. You know, I'm a religious studies scholar, so I'm really interested in getting everybody around the table and having conversations from, you know, all of the different traditions I studied and on and on. I mean, I'm still getting in emails and stories of folks from traditions that I didn't know practice this. So it's an ongoing, you know, I'm just sort of opening the door and saying, hey, let's talk about this more publicly, because it's sort of the best kept secret, hidden in plain sight, I like to say, that's been there since, you know, the beginning of our recorded histories.
I have so much respect for people who are willing to put themselves out there and introduce these ideas when they know they're going to get pushback. So, I respect that. And while I was reading the book, I just kept thinking, like, man, this takes a lot of guts for somebody to come out and say this. And I just respect it. But anyway, so you mentioned the Hindus, which that Hindu belief system, which goes into a question generally that I had. So, you know, you got the Hindus, we're in the Kali Yuga, right? But there are also all these various ideas, right? Like, what was it? 2018, I think, was when astrologers were talking about this major shift that happened, or maybe it was 2020, whatever it was. Anyway, there's various traditions saying that we've hit some kind of like critical transformational point in time in the progression of human consciousness. Do you believe that has any validity, and do you think that has any connection to this kind, I don't know if I should call it a mission, but this project that you're coming out with, and this increasing spirit contact that you are saying that people are having?
It's a good question. I mean, I'm not familiar with the astrological, forecasts or predictions for 2018 or 2020. I mean, I shouldn't say I'm not familiar. I track that a little bit, but I'm not an astrologer. What I will say is that I'm a big fan of Barbara Marx Hubbard and the conscious evolution teachings and theory, which is that humans have evolved unconsciously for thousands upon thousands upon thousands, maybe millions of years, right? Since the beginning of our species, we've evolved, and we've had these evolutionary tipping points, and we are seemingly at another evolutionary tipping point where our I-centered, our Homo sapien, I think, therefore I am, consciousness needs to evolve to an us consciousness, a consciousness not only of other humans, but of, as I've said, our nested place within the consciousness of Gaia, the consciousness of our planet. And personally, and I think my research and some of my co-researchers touched on this theme as well, I think that spirit marriage is one spiritual technology that helps us make that leap, that helps us move forward. Traditionally, we see in folkloric and anthropological accounts that these kinds of spirit marriages, they sort of precipitate our extraordinary gifts and talents in humans, whether we're talking about like the genius and the familiar or the tutelary spirits that bring through innovation or creativity in the human species, or, you know, in some of the folkloric accounts, the human otherworldly bonded relationship brought through extrasensory perception for the humans and gifts of healing and as you know, I talked about with Thomas the Rhymer, prophecy. And so I think that this is a spiritual technology that, from an esoteric perspective, helps expand our consciousness and sort of quickens us towards a much more conscious evolution, as Barbara Marx Hubbard talked about it, moving us from Homo sapien to Homo universalis or Homo spiritus, whatever that next sort of phase in our evolutionary development is going to be.
Yeah, and what you just said about the spirit marriage being, it's more than just like quote unquote marrying a spirit. Like one of the parts in the book that I found really interesting was when you were talking about the process when I think you said you were at a retreat with your mentor, Ryan Foxwood, and there was like a process that you went through, like a magical / spiritual process. I think you talked about the goddess, but it was like a general transformational process that you went through. Am I explaining this correctly so that you're understanding what I'm saying?
Yeah, I feel like there's a few accounts of that in the book.
Right, but there's the one that I'm specifically
talking about.
The specific event doesn't matter. What I'm mainly getting at is the meat is that it's not just a matter of waking up and saying, hey, I'm going to marry a spirit. You had to do a lot of internal transformational work before you got here. So could you talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, in my case, the fairy marriage or the spirit marriage that I'm in is with a fairy being. And again, just to connect the dots a bit, the fairy people as a practitioner of fairy seership, we understand them not to be like Disney's Tinkerbell, right? But these ancient primordial beings that have been the shapers of the planet. I like to say they're closer to Tolkien's elves, right, than they are to Disney. They're these wise beings that came and in many cases helped shape humans, right? And like in the Tolkien stories, and Tolkien actually took the core of a lot of his tale from both Celtic and Norse mythology. So these fairies or these elf beings, they've then sort of receded back and let humans take the stage. And he writes at sort of that change of the epoch, right? The change of Middle Earth. And so we can still have connection and conversation with these fairy beings. And one of my contacts is one of these beings, and I have lost the thread of the question.
No, it was how it initiated was I asked you about the broader transformation.
Got it.
Yes.
So, in the tradition of fairy seership, the marriage to one of these fairy type beings takes anywhere from 7 to 9 years. It is a long process. And that's primarily because and that's not the case for some of these other traditions. For example, in the Haitian Vodou tradition and the New Orleans Voodoo tradition, it's fairly common to marry a Loa, which are the deities in that tradition. And that can happen fairly rapidly. Similarly, in some of the other traditions I surveyed, but in the fairy tradition, the reason I think that it is a very long process is these primordial energies. It's kind of like sticking your finger in a light socket. For the unprepared, it can just completely fry your circuits. And there's a sort of inner alchemy that needs to happen to our nervous systems. I mean, when I went through my, I kind of call it an attunement or a calibration process, I had to change the food I ate and the way that I slept and the way that I exercised, and my career changed, my relationships. I mean, just like it was this complete overhaul on how I was operating. And my mentor Orion went through a very similar thing, and his process, I think, was a little more arduous in that it almost killed him. And that's not an uncommon thing to hear about, some of the fairy contact. And that's why there's a lot of cautions around it. I think personally, a lot of the traditional prohibitions and cautions we hear around contact with the fae is just for that reason, because our nervous systems, the human nervous system, isn't fully prepared for that. So in any event, there is a kind of calibration process, whether it's 7 years or whether it's, 7 months or whatever, or 7 weeks. I mean, there is a kind of an attunement that needs to happen for you to not only be in the relationship, but I like to talk about sort of the 3Ds of spirit marriage: devotion, discernment, and discipline. When you're stepping into these kind of extraordinary relationships, you want to develop really stellar discernment practices, right? Whether it's divination or ceremonial ritual, so that you have a really good sense of who you're working with and what their agenda is, right? Those things that I said, who am I working with? What's the agenda and what is the purpose of this? And so you've got your checks and balances in place, because we want to make sure that we are stepping into relationship with beings that we feel good about and that are benevolent and want our best, have our best interests at heart. And that just takes time. It takes time, like you would be getting to know any human person before you decided to marry them. You want to really have the practices that support that. And unlike getting to know a human person, it's not going to look the same way, right? It's not going to be the same thing where you call up your friend and, or somebody that you're dating and go out on dates. There are other things that you need to put into place to do, like rituals and various practices to cultivate the extraordinary relationship, and that requires the discipline, right, of doing it, and the devotion of like wanting to, and really feeling that the spirit that you're drawing close to, or that's drawing close to you, elicits that kind of that desire energy, which at the core of most of these practices, desire is kind of first and foremost. You have to want to do it and know that it's an actionable thing that you can do.
And what is it that besides maybe just love, but what does the otherworldly being get out of a marriage with a human being? Yeah,
it's a good question. R.J. Stewart, who is a hereditary fairy seer in the Scottish tradition, says, we do things that they can't, and they do things that we can't. We, have the ability with our corporeality, right, with our bodies, to make big, powerful, lasting changes, right, in the physical world. And they, unbound by time and space, have the ability to look at the big picture of what's going on, right, for humans and for otherworldly beings. And so those two things combined together can create some really exciting co-creative projects. So,
that's really interesting.
Yeah, so that's why I say that I think many people that are being called to step into these spirit marriages are doing so because that they have some sort of a co-creative project that wants to come out into the world. In my case, it was this material. It was this book. Part of the reason, going back to your question about why did I do this, is because that it was assigned to me. This was the outcome. Orion likes to call it the love child, my love child of my union with this extraordinary being. It was this research, because that it was time. It was time to talk about it publicly. Just like, in many circles, I'm thinking of the LGBTQI community. There was a time where that people coming out needed to happen. And I think this is a sort of new wave of like people needing to come out about these extraordinary relationships in a way that isn't being shamed or vilified. So, and also, Orion talks about how he had to also go through that calibration process. And I'm going to stop there because I lost my thread again. Review today. So
you adequately answered it.
Okay.
So one of the sections of your book, it reminded me of like Jung in the incorporating the shadow or integrating the shadow. You talk about the role of the underworld and I think you call it the dark god or the dark goddess or something like that. I'm sorry, I don't remember the exact phrasing, but can you expand a little bit on that? Because I found that interesting from a philosophical perspective about this, you encountering the darkness, interpreting the darkness, and integrating the darkness. If you could expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, growing up Pentecostal, it was all about the upper world, right? It was all about, Jesus or the angels or the Holy Spirit or these very cosmic or upper worldly energies. But Carl Jung said that a tree can only grow as high as its roots grow deep. And when I began to first connect with my spirit beloved, this being that was extraordinary being that was showing up for me, it was primarily in dreams at the beginning that the being was making contact. He showed up as both light and dark, sometimes as two faces of the same being, sometimes as twinned beings, but it was clear that it was a kind of yin yang kind of concept, light and dark, dark and light, and that it was a balancing, right? And that I couldn't have one without the other, but that I had spent, the first 20 years of my life focusing on the light, and on into my 30s, focusing on this sort of upper world light, and a lot of my training had centered around these sort of more upper world cosmologies. But when the tantric energies, when I began to connect to those and more embodied, like I said, I was trying to move down into have a really embodied spirituality, that earth, the fecund, vital force energy that arises from the underworld, right? Rises up through us. We call it Kundalini Shakti, or we call it the orgone energy, or, there's a few different names for it. That began to quicken inside of me, and I had to sort of learn how to grow my roots down deep really fast. And that's what sort of led me into the fairy seership practices, because fairy seership and many actually earth-based spiritual traditions talk about three worlds. We have the upper world, we have the surface world, and we have the underworld. And the underworld is not what many folks who've grown up within a Christian context understand it to be, right? It's not a place of punishment or evil or hell or damnation or any of these things. The underworld is where all the fecund, rich, loamy, regenerative, vitalizing practices and experiences and energies are dwelling, and also where our ancestors live, right? Mm-hmm. Our ancestors and our beloved dead are in the earth. Literally, we bury them in the earth and they become part of the soil that regenerates us, right? We eat our ancestors through the plants that we eat. And the fairy people also, we talked about earlier, were said to have gone into these realms. And so in an eco-spiritual paradigm, we understand that the underworld or the darkness, right, isn't a place of ignorance or lack or evil, but a place of mystery, of potentiation, of vitalism. And just like we would go crazy if we lived with the sun up all the time, right? We need the dark, we need the night, we need to rest, we need to do the sort of more liminal things that we do when we sleep and when we relax and when we downregulate in the dark. We need those both. And one isn't better or more important than the other, they need each other. And so that was a process that I really had to go through. And I went through that process by getting to know what's sometimes called the dark goddess and the dark god, which are just essentially beings that show up, that govern those realms and show up transculturally. They're in many, many different cultures. There's these beings that sort of govern these mystery or vitalizing realms. So that was a big piece of my process to sort of balance out all that upper world Pentecostalism from earlier in my childhood.
And did you, when you did this work, obviously you felt it inside you. Did you see changes in your life externally?
Well, like I said, I mean, the diet, the exercise, the career, the relationships. I mean, like, everything in my life changed. And my nervous system changed. You know, I mean, I've always been a fairly highly sensitive person. I don't think you grow up channeling the Holy Spirit from like the age of 1 to without being sensitized in ways that maybe, you know, somebody who didn't grow up that way wouldn't be. But in my case, I really shut a lot of that down in my 20s and 30s. For various reasons that I talk about in the book, but that I won't go into. And so a lot of my mid to later 30s was resensitizing myself and reclaiming those intuitive gifts, right? Those extrasensory gifts and that high sensitivity as a gift rather than something that I was constantly trying to like put the damp down on. And I had some really amazing transpersonal psychologists and mentors and stuff that helped me through that resensitization process. But that was a big shift for me because, you know, then I was, because when you sensitize yourself and when you're a highly sensitive person, you're not just sensitive to like spiritual stuff. I like realized I was allergic to a lot of foods and I realized that like certain situations that I was placing myself in were not conducive to like me functioning in an optimal, healthy, happy, sane state. So I had to really shift a lot of that. And my relationships, my friendships, a lot of things shifted at that point.
That's really interesting. Does being more sensitive make living in the regular world a little more difficult?
I mean, it has its, I mean, I live in the middle of a city, so
right.
Yeah, it has its challenges. And I have for many, many years been like, can't I move out into I just want to move to the country and eat a lot of peaches, right? I just want to get out of the city and be living on land. And many people do when they go through this process, they move out of an urban environment. I haven't had that luxury. And so I like to say that in my case, I'm still here in the middle of an urban environment. I garden and I found wild places in my city that I go to on a very regular basis to get my dose of, you know, vitamin nature. But it is a little bit of a hardship. And also I think that part of my work is to help people figure that out because not everybody has the luxury of being able to move out into the middle of nowhere and just, you know, Henry David Thoreau it. I mean, you know, Thoreau only lived there for 2 years anyway. So
right. All right. So before getting into the final question, let's give you a little chance to plug some services. All right. Now this is a big question because this is going to get into your ideas about the afterlife. What happens with the relationship with a person and their spirit, husband or wife, however you phrase it, when they die? Does it continue? What happens afterwards?
Yeah, I mean, it's all speculative, right? Because
right.
Any data on that. And every tradition has maybe a little bit different way that they approach it. What I will tell you about my own experience is that one of the things that became really clear to me in getting to know my my spirit companion is that he has actually been wed to my matrilineal line for generations. So I come from a line of matrilineal seers, and before they sort of converted to Christianity, it's pretty clear to me that they had a very strong connection to this being and to the land. I mean, my ancestors were British and Scottish and Welsh, and the being that I'm connected to is particularly associated with an area in Wales and southwestern Britain. So So to me, it was like, oh, I'm picking up a relationship that the women in my family and maybe some men have held for generations that was lost, when we left the old country and came here generations ago, and was lost even more when a religious conversion happened. And so, my job has been to like pick that practice back up, dust it off, set it back as an important, because those relationships, they don't die. I mean, when you look at the tradition of the familiar spirit, like say in ancient Greece, those familial spirits, which were like the household deities that a particular family worshiped, they followed you generation after generation after generation. And like in some of the Norse and Scandinavian traditions, there are those household spirits, sometimes called Nisa or Tomten, would, if a family moved, they would often move with the family and follow them. And so I think that, particularly when we go through a recalibration process to bond to one of them, it stays bonded to us often lifetime after lifetime and generation after generation. That can happen. And I'm not saying that's going to happen with every single one, but it's definitely, there's precedent for it.
Man, that's really fascinating. It makes me wonder, like, do you have any ideas about what is a family lineage on a deeper, just beyond genetic, just instead of just people being born to one another, what would cause an entity that has such a broad view of time and such a broad perspective? What is it about a family line that would matter to them?
I don't think that they're seeing us necessarily as unique individuals, right? They're not seeing us as those individual pearls on the string. I think they're seeing the thread or the string that runs through it, which is maybe something in our DNA, or maybe it's something in the way that we've integrated with them early on. And remember, when you're talking about another worldly being, they're not bound by space time. So I postulate that they're not necessarily seeing us in this like fractal but they're seeing like the larger fractal and perhaps co-experiencing all of our ancestors or all of our lifetimes simultaneously. And that's what we're interacting with. We have this very chronological way of viewing it, like, and I did this, and then I did this, and then I did this. I don't think that I think they can zoom in, right, to little points in the fractal, but I think that they have a much more comprehensive way of looking at us and our overarching sort of familial makeup.
That's really interesting. So a family then, even though each person is an individual node, there is a continuous consciousness, like a family line represents a consciousness.
Yeah. In ceremonial magic terms, it's called an egregore, and it's like the morphogenetic field. Right. We know that we have egregores when magicians come together and they do a certain working over and over and over again, the same way that builds up an egregore around that working, and it builds up an egregore between the practitioners. But there's also egregores, or these morphogenetic fields, around cultures and beliefs and practices. And I mean, even like the sports teams have egregores around them, because that it's like, here are the certain songs we sing, and here are the certain things that we do, and here are the certain practices that we have that unite us together. And so, when we're looking at like a familial egregore or an ancestral egregore, it is in many cases, the embodied manifestation in our epigenetics, right? We know from epigenetic science now that we inherit good things and we inherit traumas from our ancestors that we in our current lifetime would have no experience of, other than they show up again and again and again, and repeat in families over and over and over again. So I think that there's something to that, and to this idea of the morphogenetic field of the family, the ancestor, and that isn't to say that we should only play in Like, we don't want to take this into nativism. Like, you should only play within the ancestral tradition that you were born within, right? Because that puts us in these sort of silos and it leads to some really dangerous kinds of thinking. What we want to say is that there are certain gifts that you have that you've inherited, and you want to unpack, you want to discover and unpack, and like I said, dust them off. One of the gifts that I inherited was this family spirit, right? That is a spirit marriage that has been married to these, seers in my family line, and that I have picked that back up and done that again. There might be some other family inheritance that somebody else has, but we all of us, our ancestors were eco-spiritual practitioners, right? Maybe hundreds of generations that have passed since those practices, but they all, at some point, 2,000 some odd years ago, had various ways of working with these practices and spirits. And so it's there for all of us if we choose to look for it.
I love that you use the term morphogenetic fields, because I've only ever heard Rupert Sheldrake hear that or say that word. He always said it in context of like genetic replication, like how an organism knows how to make its genes like its ancestor was. And I've never heard it used in that term, but the reason I love that is because I've actually thought that there was like a similarity between those two. So it's good to hear my suspicions validated a little bit. But all right, so the last question. You also, in addition to being an author, you also provide transformational psychological services, I think is exactly how it's phrased.
Yeah. So, right now, what I'm doing mostly is working with groups of people and doing primarily support around people who are having paranormal, otherworldly, spirit marriage type contact and want support and community. Again, community is so important because it gives us our checks and balances and really holds us to a kind of responsibility and grounds us. And so a lot of what I do is I teach courses and I run groups for folks to talk about and practice spirit marriage. And a lot of my groups are oriented around what are the practices, devotion, discernment, discipline, and the subsets of those practices that are going to help you really have a strong, grounded, safe, and sane experience with these kinds of phenomena. I call it normalizing the paranormal, right? We think of paranormal as something that is so out there, whatever, but really it's just, as I was saying, our sort of expanded perception as humans that I think is part of what is an indicator that we're moving forward as a species. So my work is really designed around supporting people in having a good experience and really being able to devote themselves to it, discern the spirits, and take on the discipline of a daily practice.
And so, if any listeners are interested in checking out those services, are you taking on new clients right now?
I am running groups right now.
Okay.
So my one-on-one practice is kind of full at the moment, but I do have my book just came out this week, and I have a big book party on April the 21st, which everybody's invited to. It's virtual. And I'll be rolling out my next group offering there. So, and that'll come out in after the 21st in April. But essentially it's, I have a self-study program where you can learn more about spirit marriage. And then I have a group coaching program where people can come together in groups, and I kind of coach people together in going through the spirit marriage processes. And it's just a great way to meet and talk and normalize this with other people. So that's kind of, I've been so busy doing publicity for the book, which is wonderful because it seems to be something that people are really interested in and responding really well to. That's sort of my offering right now. I will open up my one-on-one practice later on, but my plate's pretty full right now.
It sounds like it. Okay, so that was supposed to be the last question, but there's one I have to ask for my own curiosity. The morphogenetic fields, is that just a connection that you made, or has that connection been, because like I said, I've only heard Sheldrake speak about that in terms of genes. Has that connection with the like spiritual body?
It's not it wasn't unique to me. I didn't think that up. I mean, the school that I went to, California Institute of Integral Studies, has a whole department there called Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness. And there is conversation about morphogenic and morphogenetic fields in that. I talk about it a little bit in the book. And being a ceremonial magician, I've connected that to the egregore. And I think it's a burgeoning topic, but I'm not the only person talking about it.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm just going to have to dig. And I somehow did not read that part in the book, so now I have to find that part. But thank you so much, Megan. This has been such a fascinating conversation. Like, I've appreciated this, and I will just keep talking your ear off, but you don't want that. Nobody else wants that. So I'm going to stop myself. So thank you very much. I really appreciate it. And good luck with the book. I hope it sells.
Thank you so much. Yeah. And if people want to learn more about the book, they can go to spiritmarriage.com. If they want to learn more about my work as a transformational psychologist, they can go to drmeganrose.com.
Okay. And listeners, all of those things will be linked in the description box below this video or below the podcast window, whichever you listen to it. So, man, thank you so much, Megan. I so appreciate this. This has been awesome.
Thank you, Jeff.
All right. Bye.
Bye.